Hi, I'm Olivia Bennett, and I never expected a simple airport check-in to turn so awkward. My mom leaned over and whispered, "Don't put her on our reservation." I froze, unsure what to do, feeling all eyes on me. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, something completely unexpected happened that left everyone in shock. The whole thing started because we were flying to settle my grandmother's estate in Maine. The Delta agent looked up from her computer screen with that practiced airline smile. Mom had already started talking, her voice carrying that tone she used when she wanted to be taken seriously. "We have a reservation under Patricia Bennett for 2 passengers. I stood slightly behind her, holding my carry-on, wondering why she hadn't mentioned my name. The familiar knot in my stomach started forming, the same one I'd felt since childhood whenever Mom decided I didn't quite belong. That's when Mom leaned closer to the counter and whispered those words that made my face burn. The agent's eyes flickered between us, clearly confused by the family dynamic playing out in front of her. I wanted to disappear into the airport floor. My sister Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside me, avoiding my gaze like she always did when Mom got like this. The whole situation felt like being 12 years old again, watching Mom pick favorites. But then the agent said something that changed everything. "Miss Bennett, I see here that Olivia Bennett is actually listed as the primary passenger on this reservation." Her voice was professional but curious. Mom's face went white, then red, then something I'd never seen before. The computer screen seemed to hold information that none of us had expected. I felt my heart skip as I realized something was happening that went beyond typical family drama. The agent continued typing, her brow furrowed with concentration. "Actually, it looks like this was booked through an estate management service. Olivia Bennett is listed as the authorized representative for the Bennett family travel arrangements." Mom grabbed the counter edge, her knuckles going white. I had no idea what an estate management service meant, but the way Mom was staring at me made my chest tight. Sarah finally looked up, her expression shifting from discomfort to genuine confusion. "That's impossible," Mom said, but her voice had lost its commanding tone. "I made this reservation myself last week." The agent shook her head politely, pointing to her screen. "Ma'am, this shows the booking was made 6 months ago through Hartwell and Associates, with Olivia Bennett as the primary contact." I'd never heard of Hartwell and Associates, but something about the name felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. The fluorescent airport lights suddenly felt too bright, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The agent handed me a boarding pass first, which felt surreal after Mom's whispered rejection moments earlier. "Ms. Bennett, you're in seat 4A. There's also a note here that you have priority boarding." Mom snatched her own boarding pass, studying it like it contained secret messages. Sarah took hers quietly, her eyes darting between Mom and me with the expression she wore during our childhood argument. The whole interaction felt like watching someone else's life unfold, except it was happening to me. Walking towards security, Mom finally spoke, but not to me directly. "Sarah, did you know about any of this?" Her voice carried accusations and hurt in equal measure. I wanted to defend myself, but I honestly had no idea what was happening either. The truth was, I'd been just as surprised as everyone else when the agent read my name first. Something was shifting in our family dynamic, and I couldn't tell if it was good or terrifying. The feeling reminded me of waiting for test results, knowing they would change everything. Sarah shook her head, but there was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom, maybe Grandma set something up before she died. You know how she was always organizing things for us?" Mom's jaw tightened at the mention of Grandma, which wasn't unusual. Their relationship had been complicated, full of old hurts and unspoken resentments. I remembered how Grandma used to pull me aside during family visits, telling me stories that Mom never wanted to hear. Now I wondered if those private conversations meant something more significant. As we moved through the security line, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to change everything. The reservation mix-up felt like the first crack in a foundation I'd always assumed was solid. Mom kept glancing at me sideways, as if seeing me for the first time or maybe recognizing something she'd tried to ignore. I'd spent 34 years feeling like the outsider in my own family, always wondering why I never quite fit. Maybe I was about to find out why. On the plane, Mom chose the aisle seat across from me instead of sitting together like we'd planned. The physical distance felt symbolic, like she was already preparing for whatever truth waited for us in Maine. I stared out the window as we climbed above thinking about Grandma's house and all the memories it held. There were rooms I'd barely been allowed in as a child, conversations that stopped when I entered spaces, family photos where I always seemed slightly separate from everyone. The patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah leaned over from her middle seat, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "Livy, are you nervous about going through Grandma's things?" It was the first time she'd used my childhood nickname in years, and it made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. The truth was, I'd been dreading this trip since Grandma died 3 weeks ago. Her house had always felt like a museum of secrets, and now we were going to dismantle it piece by piece. The flight attendant offered us drinks, and I noticed Mom ordered wine even though it was barely noon. She rarely drank during the day unless she was stressed or upset about something bigger than usual. I chose coffee, needing something warm to settle my nerves. Sarah got ginger ale, the same thing she'd ordered on every flight since we were kids. Some habits never changed, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I wondered what other constants in our lives were about to be revealed as illusions. Halfway through the flight, Mom finally spoke to me directly. "Olivia, did your grandmother ever mention anything about legal arrangements or paperwork?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the tension underneath. I shook my head honestly, though I remembered Grandma often talking about responsibility and family legacy in ways that seemed too serious for casual conversation. Those talks usually happened when we were alone in her garden, with Mom nowhere around. Now, I wondered if there was purpose behind those private moments. The pilot announced our descent into Portland, and my stomach dropped with more than just the change in altitude. Mom was gripping her armrest so tightly, I could see her tendons standing out. Sarah had gone quiet, staring at the emergency information card like it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. I felt like we were flying toward a revelation that would either finally make sense of my lifelong feelings of displacement or destroy what little family cohesion we had left. The anticipation was almost unbearable. As the plane touched down, I realized that the reservation confusion might have been the smallest surprise of this trip. Mom's reaction to my name being first suggested she suspected something I didn't even know existed: the estate management service, Grandma's planning 6 months in advance, the way certain rooms in her house had always been off limits to casual exploration. All these details were starting to form a pattern that made my chest tight with possibility and fear. I had this strange feeling that I was about to discover why I'd never quite felt like I belonged. Standing to gather our carry-on bags, Mom finally looked directly at me for the first time since the check-in counter. Her expression was a mixture of resignation and something that might have been apology. "Whatever we find at the house, Olivia, I want you to know that some things happened long before you were born." Her words hung in the air between us like a confession she wasn't quite ready to make. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and I felt my world shift just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. The real journey was just beginning. In the rental car, driving through the familiar Maine landscape toward Grandma's house, none of us spoke much. Mom gripped the steering wheel like it was anchoring her to something solid, while Sarah dozed fitfully in the back seat. I watched the pine trees blur past and thought about how different this homecoming felt from all the others. Usually, there was excitement mixed with the usual family tension, but today felt heavy with unspoken expectations. The closer we got to Grandma's house, the more certain I became that this weekend would answer questions I'd been afraid to ask my entire life. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but it still held that same sense of quiet importance that had always intimidated me as a child. Mom parked in the gravel driveway, and we all sat there for a moment, staring at the white clapboard siding and deep green shutters. Grandma's garden was overgrown now, but I could still make out the stone bench where she used to tell me stories about family history that never quite aligned with what I heard at dinner tables. Sarah stirred in the back seat, and I realized we were all waiting for someone else to make the first move toward whatever truth was waiting inside. When we finally walked up to the front porch, Mom fumbled with the key longer than necessary. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I found myself wanting to comfort her even though I didn't understand what she was afraid of. The door opened with the same creak it had made for decades, and the smell of lavender and old wood enveloped us like a familiar embrace. But walking into that hallway, knowing we were there to divide up Grandma's belongings, felt like crossing a threshold into a version of our family I'd never seen before. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt quite right anymore. The first thing I noticed was that Grandma's desk had been cleared completely. Mom walked straight to it, running her fingers across the empty surface like she was searching for invisible clues. "She always kept her important papers right here," Mom murmured, opening and closing drawers that were now conspicuously empty. Sarah hung back in the doorway, still processing the strangeness of our airport encounter. I found myself drawn to the built-in bookshelf, remembering how Grandma used to pull certain volumes down when she wanted to show me old family photographs. Something felt deliberately arranged, like a stage set for our arrival. Mom opened the main desk drawer and froze. Inside was a single manila envelope with "For Patricia" written in Grandma's careful handwriting. Her face went pale as she picked it up, turning it over like it might contain something dangerous. I watched her hesitate and realized I'd never seen my mother afraid of anything my grandmother had to say. Sarah stepped closer, her curiosity finally overcoming her usual desire to stay neutral in family tension. The envelope seemed to weigh more than it should, given how thin it appeared. "Maybe we should all sit down before you open that," Sarah suggested quietly. Mom nodded, but instead of moving to the living room, she sank into Grandma's desk chair. I settled on the edge of the sofa, my heart beating fast with anticipation and dread. Something about the deliberate emptiness of the desk, combined with that single envelope, felt like Grandma had orchestrated this moment. I remembered how she used to say that timing was everything, especially when it came to family truths. Now, I wondered if she'd been planning this conversation for longer than any of us realized. Mom's hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside were several folded sheets of paper and what looked like a smaller sealed envelope marked with my. Seeing my name in Grandma's handwriting made my chest tight with emotion I couldn't identify. Mom read the first page silently, her expression shifting from apprehension to something I'd never seen before, a mixture of grief and what might have been relief. Sarah and I waited, the silence in the room becoming almost unbearable. Finally, Mom looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your grandmother left a letter," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She explains about the reservation, about Hartwell and Associates, about why certain legal arrangements were made." She paused, looking directly at me for the first time in hours. "Olivia, there are things about your adoption that I've never told you." The word adoption hit me like a physical blow. Even though somewhere deep inside I think I'd always known, Sarah gasped audibly and I felt the room spin slightly around me. Suddenly, every feeling of not belonging made perfect, devastating sense. "Adoption?" I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Mom nodded, tears finally spilling over. "We adopted you when you were 6 months old. Your birth mother was. She was family, Olivia. She was Grandma's daughter from her first marriage before she married Grandpa." The information felt like trying to hold water in my hands. Too much, too fast, impossible to contain. Sarah reached for my arm, her face pale with shock. I realized that she'd been kept in the dark too, which somehow made it both better and worse. Mom continued reading from Grandma's letter, her voice gaining strength as she shared decades-old. "Your birth mother, my half-sister Rebecca, was very young when she had you. She felt she couldn't provide the life you deserved, but she wanted you to stay in the family." I tried to process this new reality, that my aunt had been my birth mother, that Mom had been protecting a family secret for 34 years. The pieces of my childhood suddenly rearranged themselves into new patterns. My resemblance to certain old family photos, the way Grandma sometimes looked at me with such intense love and sadness, Mom's occasional moments of what I'd interpreted as distance, but now understood as complicated. "Where is she now?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Mom looked down at the papers again, taking a shaky breath. "She died in a car accident when you were 2 years old, sweetheart. She never regretted her decision, but she wanted to make sure you knew the truth someday." The sadness I felt wasn't sharp like grief, it was softer, like mourning someone I'd already lost without knowing it. Sarah squeezed my hand, and I realized we were both crying quietly. The room felt full of ghosts, but not frightening ones. Just sad, loving presences that had been waiting for this moment. Mom handed me the smaller envelope with my name on it. "Grandma wanted you to have this directly from her." My fingers trembled as I opened it, revealing a letter in Grandma's familiar script and a small silver locket I'd never seen before. The locket was warm in my palm, as if it had been waiting for me. I opened Grandma's letter, and her voice seemed to speak directly from the page. "My dear Olivia, by now you know the truth about your beginning, and I hope you understand that every decision was made with love." Her words were gentle but clear, explaining family dynamics I'd sensed but never understood. The locket contained a tiny photo of a young woman who looked remarkably like me. "That's Rebecca," Mom said softly, watching me study the image. "She was 19 when you were born, just finishing her first year of college." I stared at my birth mother's face, searching for clues about who I might have been in different circumstances. She had my nose and chin, but her eyes held a sadness that made me want to comfort her across time. Sarah leaned over to look, her expression shifting from shock to something approaching wonder. For the first time in years, I felt like my family was seeing me clearly, without the distortion of secrets they'd been keeping. Grandma's letter continued with details about legal arrangements she'd ensure. "I inherited Rebecca's portion of the family estate. That's why your name was first on the reservation," Mom explained, reading from the additional pages. "Grandma set up the estate management service to handle your inheritance independently. She wanted to make sure you had security that came directly from your birth mother's legacy." The practical implications were overwhelming, but what struck me most was the deliberate care Grandma had taken to preserve my connection to Rebecca. Every detail had been planned with intention and love. "I need some air," I said, standing up too quickly and feeling lightheaded. The house suddenly felt small, despite its familiar spaciousness. Sarah followed me onto the back porch, where Grandma's overgrown garden stretched toward the main woods. We sat on the steps in comfortable silence, processing information that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. I was still me, still the same person who'd boarded a plane this morning. But now, the story of my life had different characters and motivations. The feeling was disorienting and strangely liberating at the same time. "I always wondered why Mom seemed so protective of you," Sarah said eventually. "Not in a bad way, just different, like she was guarding something precious that might break." Her words helped me reframe decades of interactions I'd misinterpreted. Mom's occasional emotional distance hadn't been rejection. It had been the careful space of someone protecting a secret that wasn't entirely hers to tell. I thought about all the times I'd felt like an outsider, never realizing I was actually at the center of a story everyone else was trying to honor. The irony was almost overwhelming. When we went back inside, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with photo albums spread open. "I thought you might want to see pictures of Rebecca," she said, gesturing to images I'd never been shown before. There was Rebecca holding me as an infant, Rebecca laughing with Grandma in this same kitchen, Rebecca in her college sweatshirt looking impossibly young and each photo felt like recovering a piece of myself I'd never known. Mom's voice was tender as she shared memories she'd kept locked away for over 3 decades. "Finally, our family story was becoming complete. She wanted you to know that choosing adoption wasn't about not wanting you," Mom continued, touching one of the photographs gently. "She wanted you to have stability and opportunities she couldn't provide at 19. But she also wanted you to grow up knowing you belonged to this family completely." I studied a picture of Rebecca and Mom together, their arms around each other, both of them smiling despite whatever difficult decisions they were navigating. The love between them was visible, and I realized my adoption had been an act of family solidarity, not abandonment. Everything I'd interpreted as rejection had actually been the opposite. Sarah found Rebecca's college yearbook in one of the photo albums, and we spent the next hour learning about my birth mother's interests and dreams. She'd been studying elementary education, planning to teach kindergarten. She'd volunteered at a literacy program and played intramural soccer. The details painted a picture of someone optimistic and someone who might have made different choices in different circumstances. I felt grateful rather than sad, understanding finally that my life had been shaped by multiple kinds of love. The complexity wasn't tragic. It was simply human. As evening approached, we ordered pizza and continued going through Grandma's papers and photographs. The legal documents confirmed that I'd inherited not just money, but also this house and several of Rebecca's personal belongings that Grandma had preserved for me. The inheritance felt secondary to the emotional revelations, but I appreciated knowing that Rebecca's brief life had contributed something tangible to my future. Mom seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing the secret had lifted a burden she'd carried for too long. Our family dynamic was shifting, but toward honesty rather than away from it. "I'm sorry I waited so long to tell you," Mom said, as we cleaned up the kitchen together. "Rebecca made me promise to wait until you were settled in your own life, and Grandma thought you should hear it here, in this house where so much family history happened." I hugged her, understanding finally that her occasional emotional reserve had been protectiveness, not indifference. Sarah joined our embrace, and for the first time in years, our family felt complete rather than carefully managed. The secret that had shaped so many interactions was finally and we could all stop performing versions of ourselves that left out. That night, lying in Rebecca's old room that Grandma had preserved exactly as I held the locket and thought about identity and belonging. I was still Olivia Bennett, still the daughter Mom had raised with love and intention. But now I was also Rebecca's daughter, connected to a young woman whose dreams had been interrupted, but whose love had continued through careful planning and family loyalty. The story was more complicated than I'd known, but also more beautiful. I fell asleep feeling like I finally understood why this house had always felt like home, even when I'd felt like a visitor in my own family. Outside, the Maine wind rustled through the pine trees the same way it had during all my childhood visits. But tonight, the sound felt like welcome rather than mystery. Tomorrow we'd continue sorting through Grandma's belongings, but the most important legacy had already been revealed. I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by family who had loved me enough to protect both my security and my truth until the right moment arrived. The timing, just as Grandma had always said, had been everything. I woke up early the next morning to sunlight streaming through Rebecca's bedroom windows. The room felt different now that I knew it had been my birth mother's sanctuary during her teenage years. Her books were still on the shelves, mostly young adult novels and college prep guides that painted a picture of someone planning for her future. I touched the spines gently, wondering what dreams she'd held while reading them. The connection felt tender rather than tragic, like discovering a sister I'd never known I had. I could hear Mom and Sarah moving around downstairs, their voices quieter than. Downstairs, Mom was making coffee with the methodical precision she used when processing difficult. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a shoebox of what appeared to be Rebecca's high school mementos. "There are letters in here," Sarah said softly, holding up a bundle tied with a faded ribbon. "Some from college friends, some from Grandma." Mom paused in her coffee preparation, her expression shifting to something I couldn't quite read. I realized there were still layers of this story we hadn't uncovered. Details that might help me understand not just who Rebecca was, but who I might have inherited from her. "Should we read them?" I asked, settling into the chair next to Sarah. Mom brought over 3 mugs of coffee before answering. "I think Rebecca would want you to know her better," she said finally. "She was thoughtful about leaving things behind that might help you understand her choices." Sarah untied the ribbon carefully. and we spread the letters across the table chronologically. The earliest ones were from high school friends, full of typical teenage concerns and excitement. But the later ones, written during her pregnancy, revealed a young woman grappling with impossible decisions while trying to maintain hope for everyone involved. One letter from Grandma stood out immediately. It was written during Rebecca's pregnancy, full of support but also practical advice about adoption plans. "Your baby will be loved beyond measure," Grandma had written. "Patricia and David are ready to provide everything you want your child to have." Reading these words, I understood that my adoption hadn't been a crisis decision. It had been a careful plan developed over months by women who loved me before I was born. Mom wiped her eyes as I read Grandma's letter aloud, and I realized she was grieving too, remembering the difficulty of that time while celebrating how it had brought our family together. Rebecca's college friends had written letters of encouragement, promising to visit after the baby was born and expressing admiration for her courage. These letters revealed someone surrounded by support, making a deliberate choice rather than being abandoned by circumstances. One friend wrote, "You're going to change that baby's life for the better, and your sister Patricia is so lucky to become a mom this way." The perspective shift was profound, seeing my adoption as a gift to Mom rather than a loss for Rebecca. I'd never considered how much Mom might have wanted to be a mother, how my arrival might have fulfilled dreams I knew nothing about. Sarah found Rebecca's journal from her final semester of college, after I'd been born but before her accident. The entries were mostly about her classes and friends, but occasionally she wrote about me with a mixture of love and peace that surprised me. "Olivia's first Christmas was perfect," one entry read. "Patricia sent pictures and she looked so happy and healthy. I made the right choice." There was no regret in her words, only satisfaction that her plan was working exactly as she'd hoped. Reading her contentment about my life made me feel grateful rather than abandoned, connected to her decision rather than separated by it. Mom discovered a manila folder marked for Olivia's 18th birthday in the back of Grandma's filing cabinet. Inside were report cards, school photos, and certificates from activities I'd participated in throughout childhood. Rebecca had never seen these achievements, but Grandma had been collecting them for a future conversation that never happened. "She was going to tell you on your 18th birthday originally," Mom explained. "But when Rebecca died, Grandma decided to wait until you were older and more settled." The folder felt like a bridge between my childhood and my birth mother's love, proof that I'd been cherished from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah was examining Rebecca's college textbooks when she found a paper Rebecca had written about child development. In the margins, she'd noted questions about adoption procedures and long-term outcomes for children. Even while studying for her education degree, Rebecca had been researching the best ways to ensure my future happiness. Her academic approach to my adoption revealed someone who took responsibility seriously, who wanted to make decisions based on evidence rather than emotion alone. I felt proud of her thoughtfulness, grateful that my beginning had been shaped by someone so deliberately caring about creating the best possible outcome. We spent the morning organizing Rebecca's belongings into categories: things for me to keep, things for the family archive, things to donate. Each decision felt significant, like we were honoring her memory while also creating space for me to understand my connection to her. Mom found Rebecca's college ring, which she placed in my palm with ceremony. "She would want you to have this," Mom said. The weight of it surprised me, substantial and real in a way that made my inheritance feel tangible. I wondered if wearing it would help me feel closer to the dreams Rebecca had pursued during her brief adult life. The most surprising discovery came when Sarah opened Rebecca's Hope to Seed, a cedar box I'd seen in Grandma's attic but never been allowed to explore. Inside were baby items Rebecca had collected for me: tiny clothes, a handmade blanket, a small stuffed rabbit that looked well-loved despite never being played with. At the bottom was an envelope marked "First Day of Kindergarten," containing a letter Rebecca had written to me before I was born. Her words were full of hopes and predictions about who I might become, and reading them felt like receiving a blessing I'd carried unknowingly my entire life. "She bought you a savings bond too," Mom discovered, finding financial documents in the hope chest. "Every birthday and Christmas, she deposited money for your college fund. The account had grown significantly over 2 years, and Grandma had continued the tradition after Rebecca died. Learning about this ongoing practical support made my throat tight with emotion. Rebecca had been planning for my education before I could even sit up independently. Her love had been both immediate and far-sighted, ensuring that her absence wouldn't limit my opportunities. The responsibility she'd felt for my future was staggering and beautiful. Sarah found Rebecca's camera, an old Nikon that still had film in it from her final semester. We decided to have the film developed, curious about what images she'd captured during those last months of her life. She always said she wanted to document important moments, Mom remembered. She probably took pictures of things she wanted you to see someday. The idea of seeing the world through Rebecca's eyes, even briefly, felt like an unexpected gift. I imagined her photographing moments she hoped I'd understand later, leaving visual messages across time that would help me know her better. The afternoon brought more practical discoveries, insurance policies, academic transcripts, and letters from professors who'd been impressed by Rebecca's potential as a teacher. Reading their praise for her intelligence and compassion painted a picture of someone who would have contributed meaningfully to the world if she'd lived longer. One professor had written a recommendation letter for graduate school, mentioning Rebecca's natural empathy and exceptional ability to understand child development. I realized I'd inherited more than her physical features. Her interest in helping children might explain my own career in social work, connections I'd never considered before. Mom found Rebecca's address book, filled with names and phone numbers of people who'd been important to her. Some of these friends might still be reachable, she said thoughtfully. If you ever wanted to hear stories about her college years, or learn more about who she was as a person. The possibility of connecting with people who'd known Rebecca personally felt both exciting and daunting. They might have memories that would help me understand her personality, her sense of humor, her dreams beyond the family responsibility she'd navigated so carefully. I wondered if any of them had children now, if they'd chosen different paths than the one Rebecca had walked. By evening, we'd created a comprehensive picture of Rebecca's life and her connection to mine. The inheritance paperwork showed that she'd left me not just money, but also her books, her jewelry, and specific instructions that I should feel free to make my own choices about family traditions. She wanted you to know you belonged here completely, Mom explained, but also that you were free to create your own version of belonging. The balance between honoring family legacy and encouraging individual growth felt like Rebecca's final gift, permission to be both her daughter and my own person simultaneously. Sarah helped me pack Rebecca's most personal items to take home: the journal, the locket, the hope chest contents, and several photographs. It's like getting to know his sister I never knew I had, she said. And I realized this revelation had changed her understanding of our family too. She'd grown up knowing she had an aunt who died young, but learning that I was Rebecca's daughter had transformed abstract family history into immediate, personal connection. Our sisterhood felt deeper now, rooted in shared loss and discovery rather than just shared childhood experiences. That night, we sat on Grandma's porch talking about how different our family story was from what we'd believed that morning. Mom shared memories of Rebecca's pregnancy and the adoption planning, details she'd kept private for over 3 decades. She loved you before she met you, Mom said. Every decision was about giving you the best possible life. I understood finally that my adoption hadn't been about anyone not wanting me. It had been about everyone wanting me so much they'd collaborated to ensure my happiness. The complexity was beautiful, rather than painful, proof that love could take forms I'd never imagined. As we prepared to leave Grandma's house the next morning, I took one last walk through Rebecca's room. The space felt peaceful now rather than mysterious, like a bridge between my past and future rather than a locked door I'd never been allowed to open. I understood that coming here hadn't just revealed family secrets. It had completed a story that had been waiting 34 years for its ending. The woman I'd become had been shaped by Rebecca's love as much as Mom's parenting, and knowing that made every piece of my life feel more intentional and meaningful. Driving back to the airport, our family felt fundamentally different from the one that had arrived 2 days earlier. We talked icily about Rebecca, about Grandma's careful planning, about how this knowledge would change our understanding of family gatherings and traditions. Mom seemed lighter, freed from the burden of keeping secrets that had grown heavier with time. I felt grounded in a way I'd never experienced before, finally understanding why I've always felt connected to this family despite occasionally feeling like an outsider. The airport check-in confusion that had started this journey now seemed like the smallest possible beginning to the most important conversation of our lives. The flight home was completely different from our journey to Maine. Mom sat next to me this time, sharing stories about Rebecca that she'd been saving for 34 years. Sarah leaned across the aisle, adding her own questions about our family history that she'd never thought to ask before. The airplane cabin that had felt tense with secrets 3 days ago now hummed with honest conversation. I kept touching the locket in my pocket, still amazed that I was carrying a piece of Rebecca with me. The weight of it felt like an anchor, grounding me in a story that finally made complete sense. Mom told me about Rebecca's pregnancy cravings, her excitement about decorating a nursery she'd never use, her careful research into adoption agencies before deciding to keep everything within the family. She wanted to make sure you'd always know where you came from, Mom explained, but she also wanted you to have parents who were completely ready for the responsibility. Hearing these details, I understood that my adoption had been orchestrated by people who loved me enough to prioritize my needs over their own desires. The selflessness was staggering, and it made me proud to be connected to Rebecca's legacy. Sarah asked questions I hadn't thought of yet. Did Rebecca get to hold me before the adoption was finalized? Mom's face softened with memory. She spent 2 weeks with you in the hospital and at home. She wanted to make sure the bond was real before making her final decision, and she wanted you to know her touch and voice. Even if you wouldn't remember them consciously, the idea that Rebecca had held me, sung to me, made deliberate memories with me during those crucial early days filled an emptiness I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Those 2 weeks felt like the most important beginning I could have had. She took hundreds of pictures during those weeks, Mom continued. Grandma has albums full of them that we haven't gone through yet. Rebecca documented everything: your first smile, the way you slept, how you responded to different voices. The thought of these visual records of our time together made me eager to return to Maine soon, to see evidence of the connection Rebecca and I had shared before memory could preserve it. I imagined her studying my face, memorizing details that would have to last her lifetime. The love required for that level of attention was almost overwhelming to contemplate. When we landed, walking through the airport felt symbolic. This was the same terminal where our family had nearly fractured 3 days ago, where Mom's whispered rejection had made me feel invisible and unwanted. Now we moved through the space as a complete family unit. Our understanding of each other fundamentally transformed. The Delta check-in counter where everything had started looked ordinary now, just another place where routine transactions happened. But I would never see airline reservations the same way again, never take for granted the complex stories that might hide behind simple administrative details. At baggage claim, Mom surprised me by saying, "I'd like you to come to dinner this weekend, and we can call some of Rebecca's old friends together. I think it's time to let people know that her daughter grew up beautifully." The invitation felt like an official welcome into a version of our family that had existed in secret for decades. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, and I realized she was as curious as I was to hear stories about Rebecca from people who'd known her as a friend rather than a family member making difficult decisions. The prospect of expanding my understanding of Rebecca's personality felt like unwrapping additional gifts. Driving home from the airport, I called in sick to work for the rest of the week. This discovery felt too significant to process while handling my usual routine of case management and family care. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years helping other families navigate complex emotional situations, but I'd never realized I was living in the middle of one myself. My professional experience with adoption and family dynamics would help me understand what Rebecca and Mom had navigated. But first, I needed time to simply feel the impact of learning my own story. That night, I spread Rebecca's photographs across my kitchen table and studied them like archaeological evidence. Her expressions in the pictures revealed someone thoughtful and determined, someone who approached major life decisions with both emotion and analysis. In several photos, she was holding books about child development and adoption psychology, confirming that her choice had been researched and deliberate rather than impulsive. I felt grateful that my beginning had been shaped by someone who took motherhood seriously enough to study how to do it well, even when she couldn't do it traditionally. I found myself wondering about genetics and inherited traits in ways I never had before. Did my love for reading come from Rebecca? My tendency to plan carefully before making major decisions? My career choice helping children and families? Looking at her college transcripts and seeing her grades in psychology courses, I suspected we might have shared more than physical resemblance. The possibility that my personality had been shaped by someone I'd never known felt both mysterious and comforting. I wasn't just the product of Mom's parenting, I was also Rebecca's daughter in ways that went deeper than DNA. Over the following days, I reframed decades of memories through this new understanding. Family gatherings where I'd felt slightly outside the inner circle now made sense, not because anyone loved me less, but because there had been a story everyone else was carefully not telling. Grandma's intense interest in my education and career achievements wasn't just grandmother pride. She'd been updating Rebecca's memory with evidence that her sacrifice had produced positive results. Mom's occasional emotional distance hadn't been rejection. It had been the careful space of someone honoring another woman's place in my story. The most profound shift was in my relationship with Mom. Without the confusion of wondering why I sometimes felt like an outsider, I could appreciate how completely she'd claimed me as her daughter while respecting Rebecca's role in my beginning. She'd managed to be my mother fully while never pretending to be my only mother. That balance required emotional sophistication I was only beginning to understand. Our relationship felt deeper now, built on honesty rather than careful omission, and I looked forward to exploring this new foundation. 2 weeks later, we had dinner with 3 of Rebecca's college friends who still lived nearby. They shared stories about her sense of humor, her determination to help struggling students, her excitement about family traditions she wanted to pass down someday. She talked about her baby all the time, one friend said, not with sadness, but with pride about the choice she'd made. These women remembered Rebecca as someone who'd found peace with difficult decisions, someone who'd managed to be both realistic and optimistic about complex situations. Hearing their memories, I understood that I'd inherited not just her love, but also her strength. Months later, I still wear Rebecca's locket every day, and I've started a tradition of visiting her grave on my birthday rather than the anniversary of her death. I bring flowers and tell her about my life, updating her on the woman her daughter became. The conversations feel natural rather than strange, like talking to someone who's been listening carefully all along. I understand now that love doesn't end with death or distance, it just changes form, becoming legacy instead of presence. Rebecca's love shaped my life before I existed, and continued shaping it long after she was gone, proving that the most important gifts often come from people we never get to thank properly. A year later, I'm back in Maine for the first time since our Revelation trip. This time, I'm alone, having driven up to spend Rebecca's birthday at the house that now legally belongs. The inheritance paperwork was finalized months ago, but I'd needed time to decide what to do with property that holds so much family history. Walking through the rooms alone feels different from that overwhelming weekend when everything changed. The house feels peaceful now, like it's been waiting patiently for me to figure out how to honor both Rebecca's memory and my own needs for the future. I've been coming here once a month, slowly renovating the space and making it comfortable for weekend visits. Rebecca's room remains unchanged, a shrine to the young woman who shaped my beginning, but I've updated the kitchen and turned Grandma's old sewing room into a home office. The changes feel respectful rather than intrusive. Like I'm adding my own chapter to the house's story rather than erasing what came before. Mom visits sometimes, sharing more memories about Rebecca and Grandma that help me understand the complicated dynamics that shaped our family's careful protection of. Today, I'm expecting a special visitor. Sarah called last week to tell me she's pregnant, and she wanted to come see the house where our family's next generation will learn their history. The idea of my future niece or nephew knowing the complete story from the beginning feels important to both of us. We've talked about how differently this child's understanding of family will develop, with access to truth that took me 34 years to discover. The openness feels healthier, though I understand why earlier generations made different choices with the information and social attitudes they had available. Sarah arrives mid-afternoon, her pregnancy just beginning to show. We walk through the garden together, and I tell her about the plans I'm developing to restore Grandma's flower beds and vegetable plots. Rebecca would have loved that you're bringing the garden back, Sarah says, touching the stone bench where Grandma used to tell me stories that I now understand were carefully edited versions of family history. I've been thinking about hosting family gatherings here, creating new traditions that honor our complex past while building toward a future where difficult truths don't have to be managed alone. I've been thinking about names, Sarah admits as we sit on the back porch. If it's a girl, I'd like to use Rebecca as a middle name. The suggestion makes my throat tight with emotion and gratitude. Having Rebecca's name spoken regularly in our family again feels like bringing her fully back into our ongoing story rather than leaving her as a beautiful. I tell Sarah about the journal I've been keeping, documenting my process of learning about Rebecca and integrating her memory into my daily life. Someday, Sarah's child might read it and understand how love can travel across generations in unexpected ways. We spend the evening going through more of Rebecca's belongings that I've been organizing slowly and thoughtfully. Sarah finds a collection of children's books that Rebecca had apparently been gathering for my future library. She was planning ahead even then, Sarah observes, running her fingers along the spines of picture books chosen by someone who understood child development and wanted to support my early learning. I've started reading these books to understand what Rebecca valued in children's literature, and several have become favorites that I plan to share with Sarah's baby when the time comes. Mom calls during dinner, and we put her on speakerphone to share our day of discovery and planning. She's been seeing a counselor to process the long-term effects of keeping family secrets, and her emotional availability has improved dramatically since our main revelation. I'm proud of both of you for figuring out how to honor Rebecca while building your own lives, she tells us, and her voice carries relief that comes from finally living without hidden truth. Our family relationships feel more authentic now, based on complete knowledge rather than careful navigation around topics we couldn't discuss. Later that evening, Sarah and I walked to the small family cemetery behind the house where Rebecca and Grandma are buried. I've been maintaining both graves, bringing flowers regularly, and keeping the headstones clean. Sarah places her hand on Rebecca's stone and tells her about the pregnancy, about our hopes for raising children who know their complete family story from the beginning. The ritual feels natural rather than morbid, like including absent family members in important announcements. I think Rebecca would approve of the honesty we're building into our family's future generations. That night, sleeping in my birth mother's childhood room, I dream about conversations we might have had if circumstances had been different. In the dream, Rebecca is my age, and we're sisters, comparing notes about motherhood and career choices and family responsibilities. The dream doesn't make me sad. It feels like a gift, a chance to imagine the relationship we might have built across time. I wake up feeling grateful rather than melancholy, understanding that my connection to Rebecca exists in the present through the choices I make and the love I share, not just in the past through the circumstances of my birth. On Sunday morning, I take Sarah to visit the local historical society where I've been volunteering, helping them digitize old family records for their community archive. My work there feels like extending the careful documentation that Grandma and Rebecca started. ensuring that future generations will have access to their stories without having to wait decades for revelation. The librarians have been impressed by how thoroughly my family preserved documents and photographs, not realizing that the preservation had been motivated by secret keeping as much as historical interest. Now, the same careful attention to detail serves transparency instead of protection. Driving back toward the airport, Sarah and I talk about the practical aspects of my inheritance and how it might affect our family's future. The house provides a gathering place that feels neutral and welcoming, somewhere we can host holidays and celebrations without the weight of anyone's current household dynamics affecting the experience. The financial inheritance has allowed me to reduce my caseload and take on more meaningful work with adoptive families, using my personal experience to help other people navigate complex family formations. Rebecca's legacy continues through my professional choices as much as through my personal healing. The most significant change has been in my understanding of belonging. For 34 years, I felt like I was auditioning for my place in the family, never quite sure why I sometimes felt like an outsider, despite being obviously loved. Now, I understand that I belonged completely from the moment Rebecca chose my parents, from the moment Grandma started planning for my future, from the moment Mom committed to raising me as her own daughter. The feeling of displacement hadn't been about rejection, it had been about incomplete information. With the full story, I finally feel at home in my own life. As Sarah boards her plane back to her life, and I drive home to mine, I'm carrying the peace that comes from understanding your own story completely. The revelation that began with an awkward airport check-in has fundamentally changed how I understand love, sacrifice, and family loyalty. Rebecca's brief life shaped mine in ways that continue unfolding, proving that the most important gifts often come from people who loved us too much to keep us, but too much to let us go without careful planning. I'm Rebecca's daughter and Mom's daughter simultaneously, inheriting love that multiplied rather than divided when it passed through multiple hands. The complexity is beautiful rather than painful, and I finally understand that belonging can be both chosen and inherited, both simple and profound.